Welcome to the first episode of me baking. In this episode, I'm making a loaf of sourdough. Here's my sourdough starter that I've had for a couple of years now. I'm using a scale here and measuring everything in grams. Here I'm adding 183 grams of my starter. I would have liked to add more, but I didn't have too much. Now I'm adding 400 grams of lukewarm water. Now I'm doing about 700 grams of flour, but it's a mix of about 50% bread flour to help with gluten formation, and then 25% all-purpose, and then 25% whole wheat for some flavor. Now I'm adding about 21 grams of salt. That makes about 3% of the flour weight. A lot of recipes call for 2%, but I like my dough to have a little more flavor, so I add 3% salt. Now that all my ingredients are in, I have a dough whisk, which just helps if you don't want your hands to be super messy, which will help me bring my dough together. And then after I mix this dough together, we're gonna let it sit for about 15 minutes. This will let gluten start to form inside the dough, which will make it easier to work with. Now, 15 minutes later, we're just going to take the dough and we're going to stretch and fold it. So we're gonna pull it from the edges, and we're going to give it a stretch and a fold, and turn and stretch and fold, and just make sure all the dough gets kind of pulled up from the sides. And once this is done, we're going to let it sit for another 15 minutes, and we're going to redo this process 2 more times until the gluten is sufficiently developed. By doing these stretch and folds, we don't have to knead the dough, which is considerably more work. Once the stretch and folds are done, we're gonna let the dough rest until it's doubled in size, which can be anywhere from 4 to 8 hours, depending on the conditions of your kitchen. All right, it's been 8 hours and my dough has doubled in size. And so now we're going to take a bench scraper, or you could use, I guess, a knife. This tool is really helpful though for making bread. We're going to scrape the dough to release it from the edges and then turn it out onto our work surface so that we can start to shape it. I'm making 2 loaves of bread, so I'm going to divide my dough in half using my bench scraper. I'm just going to cut down the middle until I have 2 separate pieces. Now I've put some water on my hands to stop the dough from sticking to them. It's a nice trick. So instead of putting flour in your hands, you can just wet your hands and then they won't stick to the dough. And for this first shaping, I'm just stretching and folding these into round loaves. The first shaping is just to release some of the tension from the gluten, and this will prevent our loaf from splitting in any weird spots when we do our final shaping. Now we're gonna let these rest for 15 minutes and then do our final shaping. And now I have an upgraded bench scraper, as well as some unwanted visits from my family on camera. And before I start my final shaping, I'm going to prepare my bannetons. This is where I'll put the loaves for their final proof. I'm going to be dusting them with some all-purpose flour. This is just to prevent the dough from sticking to the bannetons when they're ready to come out. And now for the final shaping, very similar to the first, I'm just stretching and folding into a round loaf. But this time, I'm putting some flour on the work surface to prevent it from sticking so that it'll have a nice and smooth top to the loaf. And now I'm going to drop this into the banneton. The smooth side is supposed to be down, so I'll fix that with the other one. And I'll do this with the other loaf. Now I'm going to top these with a little bit of flour, and then we're going to let them rest for a few hours or until they've roughly doubled in size. Now I've preheated my oven to 450 degrees, and I'm putting my Dutch oven inside so that it can come up to temperature before we start baking. All right, the dough is ready. So I've got my Dutch oven out of the oven, and here I have a lame. This is to score the bread. It's just a razor blade on a stick. Now I'm going to take my loaf and I'm going to drop it directly into the Dutch oven. Quickly, I will score it with my lame. I'm doing 3 scores here. You only really need 1, but I like to do a few. And then I'll put the lid back on and put it in the oven. We're gonna bake it for 20 minutes with the lid on. This traps steam inside and helps the bread to rise. And then after 20 minutes, I'm taking the lid off, and this will help the bread get a nice dark color on it. And now you can see the bread has a nice dark golden brown color on it, so it's ready to come out. And I'll quickly do my second loaf. And now both loaves are out of the oven. You can see they rose quite well. They split nicely where I scored them. And you can hear how crisp this crust is on the outside. And here's the bread the next morning. You can see a slice here, the beautiful crumb structure. It's nice and open, a little bit irregular. And the loaf itself is super light and full of flavor. Great with some salted butter on it.